observers from outside the United States clearly saw that the clergy were supporting the war effort. There was an outside observer who said the war is only agitation by smugglers and Presbyterians, people who are agitating under the good rule of Parliament and trying to break away.
It's my view that the clergy have been very misunderstood. Many people have viewed the clergy as being co-opted by secular or Enlightenment notions of human rights and freedom and the right of resistance and so on. So it's been common to say that the clergy got the revolution wrong, or at least the clergy weren't following the Bible. That because the clergy supported the revolution, that's an obvious indication that they were walking away from the clear, plain teaching of the Bible.
This was a long tradition. This was not unique specifically to the colonies. This was part of the culture. So preaching in wartime, preaching war sermons was something that they did a lot. So yeah, we can expect to see that in the Revolution because we saw it in the wars leading up to the Revolution, the 7 Years' War, often called the French and Indian War in the colonies, and that phase of it. It was one of several Anglo-French wars that preachers were involved in. At the end of the 17th century with King Philip's War, preachers were very much involved in interpreting the war and motivating people to join up, or in some cases, in trying to motivate people not to, and trying to proclaim a pacifist view of war. But either way, ministers are involved in war in various ways, using the Bible to make various arguments.
Is the Christian's conscience being bound, right? Is it being put in bondage? And then that's going to be the line. And as you might imagine, that kind of terminology is pretty vague. So different people come to it at different points, and some of them much more quickly, right? This is an infringement on my right of Christian liberty, and so no, I'm ready to fight. So you're going to have that question of justifiable rebellion.
The ministers were very involved in war in colonial New England, as well as other areas of the colonies. When the people went to war, and they went to war a lot, ministers were alongside them, and ministers were oftentimes giving divine sanction to the wars.
A very favorite text was Exodus 18:21, an interesting text to put it in brief context. This is a text that we read after the children of Israel have crossed over the Red Sea. And all the responsibilities and burdens of governance have fallen on the shoulders of Moses. And his father-in-law recognizes that Moses is practically working himself to death. And he comes to his son-in-law and says, Moses, you're going to need help governing these people. You need to find people that can help you shoulder the burdens of governance. And he lays out a profile, the characteristics that Moses should be looking for in rulers that can rule alongside him. And what did he identify? He said, look for able men. I take that to mean people competent in the job of governing. Able men who fear God, a devotion to righteousness, who love truth and hate covetousness. These were the characteristics that Moses' father-in-law gave to him to help him to find those who would labor with him in the governance of the children of Israel. And this is, again, a favorite text that clergymen would draw on in their exhortation to the legislature in what they should be as legislators or as the governor. Again, imagine the governor sitting literally right there in front of the minister as the sermon is being given. And so this is just another example of a religious practice being woven into the public calendar. There were sometimes similar kinds of observations for the convening of a grand jury or militia days and things like that. So there were many opportunities, quite apart from weekly worship services, when the community, crossing denominational boundaries, would convene for some kind of religious exercise, religious observance, religious exhortation.
Now, what's the role of the clergy? By and large, Christian theology is not at the bottom of revolutionary principles. It contributes and it vivifies and it makes more powerful the arguments that are beginning to prevail in the political sphere. Those arguments hinge on the defense of liberty. The link that joins together ministers and politicians is the conviction that a society will become corrupt and tyrannical if virtue is replaced by vice. What does virtue mean? Well, it might mean well-born, propertied people acting responsibly for those who are dependent upon them. It might mean the Christian believers trust in God for everything that they need in life. So there is this coming together of what we would call the liberty-loving political thinking of Britain with the Christian-inflected understanding of liberty, freedom, truth, the Bible, well-being. And it's in those terms then that a lot of clergy, not all of them by any means, but a lot of clergy begin to use languages of liberty in their sermons. And the way they do this is very often to rely upon the model of ancient Israel. Not a whole lot of direct New Testament teaching. Now, there's some, but mostly the United States, the American colonies are like Israel besieged. And Israel besieged needed people to act honorably and to struggle for their freedom. So you have, during the French and Indian War, rousing sermons to join the colonists to the British enterprise. And eventually, as we get closer to the outbreak of violence in the mid-1770s, we have American clergy, Congregationalists in New England, Presbyterians in the middle colonies, a few Anglicans in the South, using the Bible and its images to depict the struggle of freedom in the 1760s and 1770s.
It was very common to view the clergy as co-opted by Lockean thought or political radicalism. And yet to make those claims, I think, negates the whole theological and historical context of the clergy. They didn't have to look very far for examples of resistance. The Bible says, submit to those in authority. The Patriot clergy, almost en masse, supported resistance to the British. And therefore, how do we understand that? The clergy, therefore, must have been somehow co-opted or accommodated their religious thought to Enlightenment, secularism, Lockean notions, or radical British political philosophy. Whereas it's my view that the clergy were operating within their theological tradition, within their own British heritage. The clergy argued for, they justified resistance to the British based on a long-standing tradition of political resistance that said that the Bible gives us a general duty to submit to your governing authorities, but not an absolute duty. So Romans 13 says you should submit to your governing authorities. And the clergy argued that, yes, that is a general duty that we have. But if the authorities cease to be God's servant for your good, Romans 13, 3 and 4, that justification is warranted for resistance, and depending on the degrees of severity, the severity of resistance can vary. So I don't think the clergy were stepping outside of their theological tradition. I don't think the clergy did anything radical or unusual once you understand the context that the clergy were functioning in.
I think one of the things that we have to appreciate when we're looking back at the Revolutionary period, and one of the ways in which it's different from the current period, is that the sermon had a different role then. The sermon had more power then. You got to remember, they didn't have television. They didn't have a lot of forms of entertainment. Sermons were central to a lot of the social life, preaching services. In New England, they had preaching on Sunday mornings. They had services on Sunday nights. They often had lectures on days of Thanksgiving or fasting prayer during times of social crisis. The sermon had an incredible authority. And we don't know exactly what everybody thought about each sermon. We don't have a lot of comments on sermons from people in the pews necessarily, but the sermon was a force. It was not just a spiritual force, it was a religious force. And not only that, but ministers were often the most educated people in a given town. They were highly respected, not just for spiritual advice, but advice in all points of life, parts of life. So the Bible was important to them, and their preaching was employed for various reasons. So when it came to going to war, the sermon could be a fairly significant weapon. It could be a fairly significant motivator, encourager for people to take up the cause of war. And of course, where the sermon goes, the Bible goes with it, because most of these sermons were very biblical. Usually a lot of Bible verses in each sermon. So the sermon just had an incredible force at the time, an incredible authority at the time. Now, this is one of the reasons why historians have always been trying to figure out the relationship between revivals, the Great Awakening revivals that happened several decades before the Revolutionary War began, and the Revolution. And what was the relationship? It seems like everybody thought there had to be a relationship between these revivals and the Revolution. And historians have come down with various points of view on this question. But it does point to the power of the sermon and the power of the minister in a time of war or conflict to motivate people, to try to advise people in which way to go.